Close your eyes for a moment if you haven't already. Try to imagine the step, not the idea of it. Not a map or a movie still, just the feeling of it. Endless flat horizon. The whisper of wind through tall grasses. The soft clop of hooves. As a single rider crests a low hill, his silhouette black against the amber glow of morning. It is 1267, or maybe 1273. The exact date hardly matters. Time moves differently out here, unmoored from clocks and calendars. It moves in hoofbeats. This is the Mongol Empire at its height. From the banks of the Danube to the shores of the Yellow Sea, from the mountains of Siberia to the jungles of Burma, it breathes a sprawling body made of villages and yurts and frightened merchants and watchful governors. Holding it together, like invisible arteries beneath toughened skin, is something remarkable. A mail system. The YAM, the Mongol Postal Relay. You've likely never ridden 50 miles on horseback with a sealed message tied to your waist and the fear of imperial wrath trailing at your heels. But for now, try to imagine you have. The YAM was many things. Practical, terrifying, ambitious. But above all, it was tiring. There were stations called Griege, or YAM posts, every 25 to 30 miles. Some closer, depending on the terrain. At each one, a fresh horse waited, sometimes a bed of straw, sometimes a half-cooked dumpling, and a pile of other messages, all needing to go somewhere else. Most were official orders from Khan to Khan, records of grain, pleas from governors. But occasionally, nestled among them, a personal note. A son asking after his mother. A merchant trying to court a wife from afar. Even here, in the most impersonal bureaucracy on earth, human hearts still found their way. But oh, the pace of it all. Riders didn't dawdle. They couldn't. They traveled day and night, stopping only to switch horses, gulp a ladle of fermented milk, and stagger back onto the saddle. The idea was efficiency, ruthless efficiency. From Karakorum to Baghdad in just a few weeks. From Beijing to Tabriz without pause. And so they rode, sometimes with letters, sometimes with silk, sometimes with warnings, always with speed, and always under the knowing eye of the state, because this was not just a system, it was a demonstration. The YAM told the world, we are watching, we are listening, we are connected. You cannot rebel in one corner and expect the others not to know. Information, once a luxury of priests and kings, had become something else entirely. A moving force, a weapon made of speed. And yet, underneath this efficiency, underneath the raw military brilliance of a postal system that could outpace storms and rivers, there was something quietly heartbreaking, the exhaustion. Imagine being one of the relay riders, a nameless man, with sunburned cheeks and cracked fingers, too tired to eat, too wired to sleep. His horse is fast, but his heartbeat is faster. Each gallop is a promise he cannot break. The Khan's message is sacred. Delay is not an option. Now imagine being the innkeeper at a YAM station. You don't ride, you wait. Every day you boil meat, feed horses, scrub bloody saddles, and wave off messengers who do not speak. You live by the thud of hooves. You are not known, but you are essential. Or perhaps you're the scribe, sitting cross-legged in a smoky room, copying orders onto parchment, blowing gently to dry the ink, your eyes straining in the dim light. The message must be clear. Your mistake could echo across a continent. The Mongol mail system was fast, but it came at a cost. Not just to horses or roads, but to people. Quiet people. Anonymous people. People who were always tired. And yet, this relentless communication helped bind the largest contiguous land empire. In history, it worked. Brilliantly, terrifyingly, relentlessly. It's easy to think of the Mongols as brutal conquerors, and they were, but they were also administrators. They understood something we sometimes forget, that an empire lives not by swords, but by messages, by systems, by the slow, methodical work of information moving across landscapes. That's why we start here, not with a battle, not with a crown, but with a saddlebag full of dusty scrolls. Let's follow them gently. Let's see where they go. It is well past midnight when the next horse arrives. The stars hang low over the plain, and the moon is thin and crooked, like a fishing hook catching clouds. The station is a small structure barely more than a hut, really its roof of reeds. Sagging slightly, its door tied shut with twine. Inside, the smell is a mix of ash, leather, and whatever meat was last boiled over the hearth. A young boy hears the hooves first. He doesn't startle. He simply stands, ties his boots, and opens. The door, the messenger barely slows. He tosses the reins to the boy and swings down in one motion, already limping. His eyes are crusted with sleep he hasn't had in days. His breath forms quick, angry clouds. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. Inside, the innkeeper sets a wooden bowl on the low table. Sour milk, hard bread, a lump of sheep fat. The messenger chews without tasting. He glances around for the scribe. She's already waiting. Cross-legged in the corner, ink-stained fingers and a brush tucked behind her ear. She unrolls the worn parchment and begins transcribing. The original document is damp from sweat and slightly torn, but the seal is intact, Gaya Khan's personal stamp. It must move west urgently. The scribe works fast, murmuring the characters under her breath, like prayers. The boy resaddles a new horse outside. This entire process arrival, food, copy, switch, is designed to take no more than 12 minutes. Sometimes it takes 15. And if it does, the next station down the line will have to make up the time. The Mongol Yam relay network included thousands of such stations. Some were small, like this one. Others, near cities or river crossings, were nearly towns in themselves, complete with stables, kitchens, even guards. But the rhythm was the same, constant, quiet, unrelenting. It wasn't just about speed. It was about presence. The idea that at any moment, the Khan could reach you. The post system wasn't merely infrastructure. It was imperial philosophy in physical form. The scribe finishes, the ink dries. The rider stands. He takes the new scroll, tucks it into the pouch by his chest, drinks the last of the milk. And then, with a quiet nod, he's gone again, out into the vast dark. The boy returns to the hearth. The scribe yawns. The innkeeper starts boiling water for the next arrival, already visible on the horizon as a distant, bobbing dot of lantern light. And so it continues, a rhythm of hoofbeats and ink, of urgency wrapped in silence. This is the Yam. And this is only the beginning. Now that we've settled into the rhythm of a single relay station, let's step back, zoom out, not too fast, not all at once. Let the map unfold gently. A parchment scroll on a wooden table in Karakoram, inked by calloused hands. Now let it widen east. To west, mountain to steppe, river to ruin, until what you see is not a single road, but a lattice. A spider's web spun across half the known world. This was the Yam. But it was more than roads. It was more than horses and huts and boiled meat. It was a system of presence, of reach. Every station, every rider, every handful of millet given to a passing courier was part of a structure so vast, so methodical, that it kept the Mongol Empire breathing long after the conquests had ended. Under Genghis Khan and his descendants, these postal roads became arteries of empire. And just like arteries in a body, they didn't just move one thing, they moved everything. Information, yes. Orders, intelligence. But also grain, silk. medicine, rumors, and spies. You see, for all their emphasis on conquest, the Mongols didn't just want power. They wanted certainty. They wanted to know. If a province faltered, if a warlord grew too bold, if a merchant in Samarkand whispered the wrong name in the wrong ear, the Yam would know. The report would arrive. And the response, like the messenger, would come swiftly. To serve this system, the empire levied what was called the Yam tax. Local farmers, even distant villagers, were required to contribute fodder, food, beds, even their homes. If you were near a relay road, you might suddenly find your barn repurposed as a temporary postal outpost. You couldn't say no. The cons. Mail rode above your preferences. And yet there was pride, too. For some, hosting the Yam wasn't a burden. It was a strange, exhausting kind of honor. Your fire warmed the empire. Your millet fed its riders. Your quiet work, unnoticed by history, kept the wheel turning. And sometimes, only sometimes, the messenger would leave a piece of news behind. A whisper from the capital. A death. A birth. A shift in the stars. Imagine the thrill of it. You, a herder in the Altai Mountains, hearing before anyone else that the Khan's heir had died. You, a woman whose brother had disappeared into conscription, suddenly holding the message that might contain his handwriting. The roads were wide, but they felt personal. They reached into lives in unexpected ways. And though the Yam was imperial, in scale, it was also fragile. It required constant tending. Horses rotated, routes cleared, bridges built. Snow could break it. A single ambush could unravel a line. The empire knew this. So it invested, not just in infrastructure, but in loyalty. Postmasters were sometimes exempt from other taxes. Riders received stipends. In some cases, entire towns formed around the most central stations, blending administration with community. And always the hooves moved, even in blizzards, even in drought, even when the rider could barely stay upright, or the parchment was so damp it needed to be dried over a fire before it could be read. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was belief. A belief in order, in continuity, in the idea that an empire, no matter how large, could still whisper to itself. So tonight, if you hear the wind brushing against your window, imagine it carrying the sound of distant hooves, not frantic, not violent, just steady, persistent. The empire is listening. And somewhere, far away, someone is writing it all down. Let us now return to the rider. You've met him before in passing. Exhausted, silent, defined only by his pace. But who was he, really? The messengers of the Yam were not soldiers, though many had trained like them. They were not merchants, though they carried value greater than coin. They were not scholars, though their minds had to be sharp and exacting. They were something else entirely. Living vessels of the empire's memory. Fast, anonymous, and impossibly durable. Most were. Mongol men, but not all. The empire's diversity extended into the saddle. Some were Uyghurs, Tanguts, even Chinese or Persian. What mattered was loyalty and endurance. What mattered was that you could ride hard and read a dispatch by moonlight. That you could memorize a message if the scroll was lost. That you could cross mountain passes in midwinter and not lose your nerve. They rode with little armor. Speed was everything. Their saddles were light, designed for efficiency, not comfort. Their clothes were practical, layered wool, leather bindings, felt, boots, and beneath all of it, the quiet ache of unrelenting duty. Imagine a life measured not in days or months, but in routes. A rider might make 3 relays a night, then collapse in a barn for 6 hours before repeating the journey in reverse. Some memorized the terrain so deeply they could ride blindfolded. Others carried emergency supplies, knives, dried curds. bits of honeycomb wrapped in linen, lucky charms. Superstition ran strong. You don't spend your life galloping through the darkness without clinging to something beyond logic. Tiny gods carved from bone, a pouch of dirt from home, a lock of fa, hair tied to the reins, protection from wolves, from robbers, from imperial wrath if the message failed to arrive. There are stories, quiet ones, not the kind sung in songs of riders who died on the trail, of messages found in their satchels days later, of horses returning alone, but most made it, most endured, because in the Mongol world, failure in the mail system was not just an inconvenience, it was a threat to the whole structure. You did not simply arrive late. You were held responsible for the consequences. It is said that Genghis Khan himself once rode the relay roads in disguise, testing the system. Whether that tale is true or not, the point remains. The system had to work. And so the riders never truly stopped moving. If they had a family, it waited without complaint. If they had ambitions, they buried them under dust and duty. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. There are no epic poems for the man who delivered census forms or troop orders. No statues for the one who braved floodwaters with a rolled decree, but the empire owed them everything. And so do we, in a way, because every historical event, every shift in power, every decision by a Khan was enabled by a message. And every message needed a rider, galloping through the twilight, swallowed by the wind. Let's pause now, far from any palace or battlefield, and sit cross-legged on a felt rug inside a yurt pitched not far from one of the main yam relay roads. Outside, the wind is playing its soft flute across the grasslands, ruffling the round woolen dome above. Inside, a small fire crackles in a bronze brazier. The smoke curls up and out through the circular hole in the roof. The crown of the yurt, always open to the sky, like an eye that never closes. It is a quiet home, but never truly still. That's what it meant to live near the yam. Even if you weren't part of it, if you weren't the messenger or the scribe or the stable, and its rhythm brushed up against your life, constantly. Sometimes gently, like a stranger asking for water. Sometimes like a storm. Imagine yourself here, perhaps as the wife of a minor local elder, or a boy whose job it is to collect horse dung for fire. Your days are normal, tending sheep, weaving felt, boiling milk. But 3 or 4 times a week, a rider passes dirt-covered, exhausted, needing food or help or just to be seen. You stop what you're doing. Everything waits. And when they leave, the stillness returns. But it's a different kind of stillness, one that hums faintly, like the echo of hooves in the back of your mind. Some families near the yam routes became unofficial hosts post people without the title. Their homes became semi-permanent outposts, their daughters known for their lentil stew, their sons quietly learning how to patch a saddle. It was unpaid, it was unchosen, but it was part of life. The yurt, as modest as it was, became a witness. It overheard the whispers of riders, half mad from lack of sleep. It cradled the snores of men who had not seen a real bed in weeks. It saw, fingers trembling from cold or fear or sheer exhaustion. And sometimes it saw them weep. Yes, even messengers cried. Not often, not dramatically, just a silent few tears, while warming their hands by the fire, remembering home or mourning a comrade lost along the route. And the yurt, old and stitched and quiet, bore witness. What did it feel like to live so close to the heart of the empire, and yet remain utterly anonymous? To feed the messengers, but never receive messages yourself? To offer shelter, but never be sheltered? Still, there was a sense of belonging, a strange kind of importance. After all, every great empire relies on the unnoticed. The Mongols, surprisingly, acknowledged this in their own way. While the elite debated policy and territory, small tokens of gratitude trickled down the line, sometimes a goat, or a bolt of cloth, or a kind word from a local governor. It wasn't much, but it reminded people that the yam needed them. And in turn, these domestic lives adapted. Children were taught not to ask too many questions of the riders. Meals were kept warm longer than necessary in case a courier came late. Extra hay was set aside for passing horses. Little rituals formed cups always set out in threes. Fire always kept low at night, as if the house itself expected visitors. All of this for a system most of them didn't even fully understand. They knew the yam was imperial. They knew it moved messages. But the larger machinery, the councils, the khans, the governors, it felt distant. Abstract. What was real was the dust on the floor after a messenger passed through, the steam rising from a reheated broth, the saddle left drying on the fence, the sudden hush when someone came galloping over the ridge. That was the rhythm of the yam as it touched ordinary. Life, not fanfare, but footsteps. By now, you may be wondering, how did it all actually work? Not in the broad strokes of messengers on horses, but in the quieter gears of administration. The unseen clockwork. The paper trails behind the hoofbeats. Let's settle now at the relay station, not in the field, but in the logbooks. It's dusk. A low fire burns in the corner. A young scribe, perhaps barely more than a boy, leans over a wooden table. His eyes sting from smoke and sleeplessness. His ink is thinned with melted snow, but still he writes. Names, times, routes, feed quantities, complaints. Each rider who passed left more than dust and sweat. It left paperwork. Not the tidy paperwork of our modern minds, no folders, no staplers, but records all the same. Tally marks etched into bark. Crude. Stamps in wax. A signature, if the man was literate. A seal, if he carried rank. Every station along the yam had to account for its horses, for its fodder, for its rations, for its riders, and for the time they arrived and departed. It was not a system run on whim. It was, for all its speed, astonishingly methodical. Imagine the tension in that relay office when two riders arrived at once, one on time, one late, and both claiming priority. Imagine the tired debate about whose seal carried more weight. Imagine the look exchanged between station master and scribe, knowing that a misstep could mean accusation, emotion, or worse. The Mongol administration, while far more tolerant than its reputation might suggest, did not suffer negligence. The scribe does not look up as the messenger slams his cup down, demanding oats for his horse. The station master sighs. Somewhere outside, a mare nickers softly. They will resolve it, as they always do, with politeness and hierarchy, and a bit of quiet bribery if needed. The paperwork, though, will be flawless, because the yam was not just a system of horses, it was a system of accountability. A web of documentation so quietly vast it boggles. The mind, across valleys and rivers and deserts, 1,000 tiny stations scribbled in tandem. Quiet clerks ensured that the empire remained stitched together, not just by messages, but by memory. This wasn't just bureaucracy. It was stability. And in its own way, it was sacred. Because in a world that moved so fast, with horses flying across the steppe and khans rising and falling with the seasons, this was the stillness, the ink, the trace, the record that someone somewhere had come through this place, and someone had cared enough to write it down. Let's now turn our attention to a quieter, more ephemeral thing. Trust. A horse can carry a message. A road can take it across the empire. But what makes a message believable? What makes it real? In the Mongol world, that weight rested not on the ink, but on the pesa. The pesa, or tablet of authority, was a small but mighty item. Carried by official messengers, it was usually made of wood, bronze, or silver. Oval, rectangular, sometimes inlaid with the Great Khan's seal. It bore inscriptions, marks of legitimacy. And in the eyes of station masters and villagers alike, it was more powerful than any sword. If you carried a peza, you were not just a man on a horse. You were the voice of the state. You could demand fresh horses. You could command shelter. You could pass unmolested through hostile territories. You were, in effect, inviolable. But of course, any system built on trust is vulnerable to misuse. Imagine the anxiety of the station master when a new rider appears, face unfamiliar, claiming urgent business and flashing a worn peza. The script is smudged, the edges chipped. It looks real, but then again, so did the last counterfeit. And that one led to missing supplies. So a quiet test begins. The master feigns casual questions, cross-references the logbook, sends a boy to fetch the local commander under the pretense of needing more oats, all while smiling politely, offering warm tea. The rider, tired but calm, understands the game. He plays along, offers no offense. The weight of the peza rests heavy at his hip, but trust must be earned, not demanded. This subtle dance happened 1,000 times a day across the Mongol world. Trust built not on familiarity, but on formality, protocols, procedures. The gentle pressure of empire. Even counterfeit pezas were rarely punished with violence, unless fraud led to rebellion or loss of life. More often, it ended in quiet confiscation. A note in the margin of a ledger. A nod passed up the chain. Because to preserve trust, the system could not be visibly brittle, and so the Mongols developed layers, seals, counter-seals. In some cases, physical tokens tied to specific routes. Colors for different ranks. It was not perfect, but it worked. Well enough to knit together the largest land empire in human history. All without emails, without phone lines, without radio. Just horses, paper, metal, and 1,000 tiny, patient acts of trust. Today, most of those pezas have vanished, buried, lost, melted down. But in a museum drawer in Ulaanbaatar, one still sits, bronze, slightly curved, quietly dignified. Its script reads, "By the power of the Khen, let no one delay this man." And for a moment, you can almost hear hoofbeats in the silence. Now, let's settle into the saddle. Not metaphorically, but quite literally. Because to understand the Mongol postal system, one must understand the man who wrote it, the girded rider, the flesh and blood hinge on which the whole sprawling system turned. You might imagine him as bold and broad-shouldered, galloping dramatically across the plains like a windswept epic. And yes, there was strength. But more than strength, there was endurance, grit, repetition, routine. This was no cinematic warrior ride. It was a job, one that exhausted even the toughest men. The average relay rider rode between 25 and 40 kilometers between stations. That distance might not sound impressive by today's standards, but remember, they did this several times a day, often in harsh weather, with only brief pauses between mounts. Snow? They rode. Heat? They rode. Hunger? Imagine yourself wrapped in fur and leather, the saddle damp from the last rider's sweat. Your breath forms clouds in the frigid air, and the world around you is utterly silent except for the rhythmic pounding of hooves and the soft creak of harness leather. The landscape is a flat smear of gray. No trees, no cover. Just the wind and your thoughts. The message pouch at your side is tightly sealed. You do not read it. That's not your role. Your role is movement, not meaning. At each station, the same. Pattern unfolds. A shout, a scramble. The fresh horse brought forth already panting from anticipation. No time to dismount politely. You swing from one mount to another as handlers grab the reins. Water is thrown on your face. Sometimes it freezes. Before it drips. And then, like a pebble in a slingshot, you're gone again. Food? Rarely hot, often dried. Fermented Mare's milk, if you're lucky. A bit of meat, perhaps a dumpling reheated in haste. And yet these riders became folk heroes in their own quiet way. The Empire relied on them. They were as much a part of statecraft as any can or minister. But they were also lonely. Most relay riders traveled alone. Conversation was a luxury for the station hearth. On the road, there was only you and the horse, and even then, only for a short while before your next mount. No bond was formed. No names were given. You were a shadow moving from campfire to campfire, barely noticed and almost never thanked. But you knew the lives you touched, the treaties you delivered, the emergencies you soothed, the orders you carried, sometimes even executions. Yes, those too were sent by letter. And yet, the job was not without its comfort. You became known to the station masters, a name murmured at the door, a favorite spoon reserved, the warmest corner of the yurt when blizzards raged, a familiarity that didn't need words. You belonged to the road, but the road also knew you, and that was enough. So the next time you hear of Mongol conquests or emperors on golden thrones, pause for a moment and picture a tired rider, boots crusted with frost, stomach grumbling, mind already halfway to the next station, his saddlebag full of empires, and his heart quietly, steadily beating with the rhythm of the road. Let us take a moment now, not for the riders, but for the true lifeblood of the system, the horses, not war horses, not pampered parade stallions. These were working animals, rugged, endlessly patient, and absolutely vital. A Mongol Postal horse was not chosen for beauty. It was chosen for stamina, for spirit, for the ability to survive on dry grass and frozen wind and keep running. These creatures were built for the long haul, short-legged, barrel-chested, coated in thick hair against the cold, a far cry from the sleek, nervy breeds of the Roman cavalry or medieval knights. At every relay station, between 10 and 20 of these horses would be kept in readiness, groomed, fed, and rotated like soldiers on duty. The station master knew them all by temperament. Which one ran fast but tired quickly, which one kicked, which one always made it home, no matter how deep the snow. Some had names, many didn't, but they were remembered. Imagine a scene. A horse stands tied outside a felt yurt, steam rising from its flanks. It has just completed a 30-kilometer sprint through sharp winds. A young handler rubs its legs with cloth. Inside, the rider warms his hands over a brazier. He does not thank the horse. It is not Mongol custom to do so aloud, but he notices. He remembers. He will request that same horse next week. And what of the horses who fell ill or grew old? They were not discarded. Many were allowed to retire near the stations they had served. Some became herd sires. A few, if especially renowned, had their bridles hung as tokens of honor. A horse that had served the Gert O Umlaut well, was often more respected than a man who had not, because horses, you see, don't lie. A horse won't carry a rider it doesn't trust. A horse can sense fear, deception, illness. If a rider lied about his identity, the horse sometimes knew before the station master did. They were living barometers of truth. And in an empire that valued loyalty above almost all else, that was no small thing. Even Genghis Khan himself is said to have respected horses above generals. His armies moved on them. His letters rode on them. His empire breathed with their rhythm. So as we drift now further into the world of hooves and dust, let us remember the heartbeat beneath the empire was not always human. It was four-legged, muzzle-snorting, straw-munching, tireless, and utterly necessary. The road stretched far, but never farther than a horse could carry it. And in the quiet of the station, after the message had gone, only the gentle chewing of hay remained. A kind of silence, full of meaning. If the riders were the muscle, and the horses the legs, then the station masters were the heartbeat, the steady, grounding rhythm of the Mongol postal system. They didn't gallop across the steppe or handle imperial secrets firsthand, but without them nothing would have moved, not a hoof, not a letter, not a single command. Every 25 to 40 kilometers, a yurt or a small timber house appeared like a mirage in the expansive grassland. A station, modest, unassuming, but crucial. It might have been built of stone in the mountainous regions, or simple felt in the plains, but always it held the same purpose: shelter the rider, feed the horses, and protect the message. The station master, often a man past the age of riding, was not just a caretaker. He was an administrator, a record keeper, and more often than not a quiet judge of character. He could tell by the dust on a rider's boots how long he'd been in the saddle. He could tell by the horse's eyes whether it had been pushed too hard. And though he was not formally educated, he often knew more about the comings and goings of the empire than some at court. Imagine him now wrapped in wool, seated cross-legged near a fire pit. His ledger rests on one side, a steaming bowl of broth on the other. Outside, the wind slices across the grassland in low, low whistles. Inside, warmth pools around the central hearth. He waits. Riders are never early, but they are never late. His home is humble. A bedroll in the corner, a shelf with dried meat and Mares cheese, another with medicinal herbs. Hooks on the wall hold spare saddles and bridles. Water skins hang from a crossbeam, dripping quietly from the snow thaw. It is a world measured not by clocks, but by hoofbeats and need. He keeps a tally of everything. Riders in, riders out. Horses borrowed, horses returned. Messages, too, though he doesn't read them. He logs their presence. One mistake in this system could cause a war, or delay a marriage, or doom a grain shipment. He knows this. He feels the weight of it every day. And yet there is a kind of peace to it. Life at the station is predictably unpredictable. Some nights are quiet, uneventful, marked only by the crackle of firewood and the soft chew of a horse outside. Other nights bring injured riders, frostbitten fingers, messages wrapped in red silk that require immediate relaying. Through it all, the station master stays composed, measured, the keeper of continuity. Sometimes, travelers not official riders arrive and request shelter. The station master is allowed to offer food and rest, but only if it does not interfere with the postal riders. Priority is always given to the Gurdig. Everyone knows this. Everyone respects it. It is the invisible hierarchy of the steppe. He may go weeks without hearing any real news, and then suddenly, through a brief exchange with a weary rider, he'll learn that a Khan has died, or that war is on the horizon, or that a distant cousin has been appointed governor. These moments are quiet. He doesn't exclaim or react. He simply nods, records the date. The pot continues to boil. Life goes on. And sometimes he thinks, what might it be like to ride again? To feel the cold wind on his cheeks, the reins taut in his hands, the horizon galloping toward him? But he does not dwell long on such things. There is hay to pitch, a mares foaling, a saddle needs repair. He tends his post quietly and without praise. And when he passes, perhaps a note is made in some distant ledger. A new station master replaces him. The fire is relit. The system breathes on. And so, behind every successful message that crossed the Mongol Empire, there was a yurt, a hearth, and a man who waited. A man who made sure nothing not snow, Not war, not time interrupted the rhythm of the road. So far, we've followed the wind-blown path of the postal rider. We've met the station master, sniffed the steam of the broth, and brushed frost off saddle leather. But we haven't yet looked at what all of this effort was actually in service of the message itself. It's easy to overlook the thing tucked so tightly into the rider's pouch. It doesn't neigh, it doesn't sweat, it doesn't demand feeding. And yet it was often more powerful than any sword. A letter, a scroll, a decree sealed with a bit of wax and authority. Let us unfold one now gently. The parchment is thick, slightly stiff from the cold. It might be made of paper, or even birch. Bark depending on region and urgency. The ink is dense and earthy, likely derived from soot or gall. Smells faintly metallic. A small brush, not a quill, traced the letters. And those letters, they may be written in Uyghur script, which the Mongols borrowed and bent to their needs. Vertical, elegant, with loops that descend like vines. It's not a script that rushes. Every line is deliberate, composed. Who wrote it? A scribe, most likely. Someone trained in courtly language and the art of compression, because Mongol letters often carried the weight of commands in astonishingly few words. Concise, direct. The kind of writing that didn't ask, it declared. The letter may bear the seal of a Noyan, a prince, or even the Khan himself. This wasn't just decoration, it was protection. A seal could grant immunity, access, or even life. To touch a message sealed by the Khan was to place your fingers on the pulse of the empire. But not all messages were grand. Some were letters of debt, marriage arrangements, reports on snowfall, grazing conditions, trade inventories. Some were love letters, to believe it or not. Soft words crossing brutal terrain. Because even in an empire known for conquest, people still missed each other. Imagine that. A rider braving a sandstorm, hands raw from rains, just to bring a folded piece of bark with a handful of words. Come home soon. The baby walks now. The power of that. Now think of how many such messages passed through Gerdug each year. Tens of thousands, maybe more. The Mongol administration was nothing, if not thorough. The Yam system, which carried both personal and state correspondence, became so trusted that foreign emissaries relied on it. Marco Polo, as we'll see later, marveled at its efficiency. To him, it was as miraculous as flying, and perhaps it was, because there is something magical in the mundane, in the idea that, over hundreds of miles of grassland and snowfield, message could travel almost untouched, protected, trusted, passed hand to hand like a sacred object. And all this effort, this bone-deep exhaustion, for a scroll no longer than your arm. Such is the paradox of civilization. Sometimes the quietest. Things carry the farthest echoes. In the year 1246, Gayok Khan, the grandson of Genghis, ascended to the supreme seat of Mongol power. It was a chilly year, even by Mongol standards. And with his ascension came not only the usual flurry of palace reorganization and court drama, but something far more permanent. A torrent of pesa, or imperial tablets, etched in gold and issued across the empire like falling leaves from a tree. These weren't letters. They weren't simple badges. They were more like passports, command cards, and divine licenses all wrapped into one small object metal, heavy and pulsing with imperial authority. Gayok issued them liberally, sometimes recklessly. A gold tablet could demand fresh horses. At every post, food and shelter from every station. A clear road through every border. It made a merchant into a king, an emissary into an untouchable. Some bore the imperial inscription, carved into them in blocky authority, by the power of the eternal blue sky. That wasn't metaphor. That was law. At first, this sped things. Up, traders from the Silk Road carried their goods with confidence. Diplomats traveled more efficiently. Messages surged through the system like spring runoff. The Yam network gleamed under the weight of purpose. But then cracks. Too many tablets. Too many golden passes fluttering like feathers down onto a web that was already taut. Everyone was suddenly special. Everyone had the Emperor's signature. Station masters began to groan. They were legally required to provide horses and supplies, but their hay reserves ran dry. Riders had to be pulled from routine routes just to satisfy a sudden envoy heading for Kashgar with 4 camels and a letter from Gayek. The exhaustion, once a background murmur in the system, began to sing. Imagine a station master now bowing low to a merchant with a gold pesa, forced to give up his last 2 fresh horses. He watches them vanish into the dust, knowing the official rider coming tomorrow will find nothing waiting for him but a worn-out mule and some stale curds. These were the pressures that turned the Yam system from a marvel into a burden. Gayek, for his part, saw this only briefly. His reign was short. He died 3 years after his enthronement, likely from alcoholism or illness or both. The empire mourned him, quietly and from a distance. No one wanted to speak ill of the Khan, even when his policies had left supply lines gasping for air. And yet, in his golden tablets, Zhuhai left behind a kind of legacy, a physical fatigue baked into the infrastructure of empire. His orders lingered. His permissions were hard to revoke. No one wanted to offend a merchant with a shiny token. No one wanted to risk the wrath of some distant Noyan who had gifted it. Even in death, his fingerprints stayed. But the Mongol Empire was resilient. If nothing else, in time, the issuance of pesa would be reined in. Kublai Khan would try to restandardize the system, issue proper registries, and restore balance. And yet, the strain never fully left. Once an empire learns to bend the rules, it's hard to make it straighten again. And somewhere, deep in the vast ribs of the Yam system, a man still stoked the fire, still waited, still watched horses vanish into the distance, ridden by men with gold in their hands and fatigue in their wake. His name was Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, a man whose name might be too long to whisper before sleep, but we'll try. He was not a soldier, not a trader, not even a merchant. He was a friar, a Franciscan, sent by the Pope to the Mongol court in the 1240s with one impossible mission: convince the Mongols to become Christian, or, failing that, at least convince them not to invade Europe. The odds were, as you might imagine, not exactly in his favor. He was elderly when he set off, nearly 60, white-haired, and not particularly robust, not someone built for the saddle. And yet, he would ride for over 3,000 miles. Across Poland, through the cold-breathed mountains of Ukraine, past the Caspian Sea, and into the heart of the Mongol world. Why? Because of the Yam system. It wasn't just for Mongols. In theory, it served anyone carrying the proper authorization. Giovanni had a letter imperial permission granted through intermediaries, and so, step by step, hoofbeat by hoofbeat, he followed the same rhythm as the couriers, the same trail, the same exhaustion. He arrived in Karakorum in 1246, weak, half-frozen, and probably regretting every vow he'd ever taken. But he was also alive, and had witnessed something few Europeans ever had: the inner roads of the Mongol Empire, powered not by brute force, but by infrastructure. He saw the stations, slept in the yurts, saw how horses were rotated with eerie efficiency, how fresh mounts stood saddled and ready, as if someone had dreamed his arrival the night before. He also saw the consequences. He saw station masters straining to supply goods. He saw herders who'd been conscripted into feeding emaciated mounts. even if it meant shorting their own animals. He saw what we've seen, the quiet exhaustion beneath the system's elegance. But still, he marveled. He returned to Europe 2 years later with tales of cities built like camps, of archers who could ride backwards, and of an empire held together not just by conquest, but by the whisper of horses. Giovanni wrote it all down. And in doing so, he preserved something rare, not just the structure of the Mongol world, but the texture, the chill in the air, the smell of butter tea, the ache in his bones, the strange quiet between stations, where all you could hear was the horses breathing and the distant echo of empire. And maybe, in that quiet, something else too, a recognition. That even the mightiest systems are built on small things. Tired men, frayed saddlebags, ink that dries too slowly in the cold. That history moves not only by battles, but by blisters. So tonight, spare a thought for the old friar who rode too far, who followed the hoofprints and lived to tell the tale, who showed us that sometimes witnessing is enough, that writing it down can be a kind of answer, even when the empire doesn't listen. Among the unsung objects that held the Mongol postal system together, few were more crucial or more overlooked than the saddle. Yes, the horse was the engine, the rider was the courier, but without the saddle, neither would last a day on. The step. Picture it not as a single piece, but a bundle of careful effort. Wood, softened leather, sometimes felt padding each part, stitched, bound, or nailed into place by hands that knew the value of balance. A Mongol saddle was not like its European counterpart. It was lighter, higher, with a distinct curve that allowed riders to stand while galloping. This preserved their legs and backs vital for long-distance couriers who might ride for 14 hours in a single day. Now imagine this saddle being passed from man to man, yurt to yurt, over hundreds of kilometers. In theory, every station kept its own, but in practice, saddles aged, cracked, tore. Replacements were slow to arrive. So often, a rider would carry his own familiar fit, broken in, reliable, like a second skin for both horse and man. Inside the felt walls of a way station, the saddle became more than gear. It was hung by the fire to dry, inspected for signs of wear, repaired with sinew, beeswax or thread soaked in fermented milk. Riders shared tricks. A bit of goat fat softened the stiff straps. Birch resin mended cracked pommels. There was a kind of rhythm in these rituals, a kind of comfort, because while the routes changed and the terrain grew cruel, the saddle remained. Constant, a small anchor in a world always galloping forward. Now, settle into the sound of hooves again. Think of the road not as a single line, but a weaving tapestry of hoofprints. Trails that crisscrossed valleys, curved along rivers, vanished into forests. Roads without signs, yet known intimately by the riders and their horses. Each section of the yam was maintained not just by orders from above, but by the practiced routines of ordinary people. Every 25 to 40 kilometers, a stop, a fresh horse, a cup of Arag fermented Mari's milk, a word or two exchanged, rarely more. These riders were men of motion, not conversation. Sometimes a message was passed without words. The weight of the scroll, the design on the seal, a single nod. The system trusted that everyone knew their role, because everyone had learned it by repetition. And yet nothing about it was easy. Snow piled deep on the mountain passes. In the Gobi, the sand could swallow the trail overnight. Rivers swelled in spring and froze in winter. And still the system moved, like breath, in and out. A rhythm, built not on glory, but on routine. It was that routine, perhaps more than anything else, that held the Mongol world together. Not just swords or bloodlines or banners waving in the wind, but the simple, repeated acts of waking early, saddling, up, and riding. And always the saddle, that unassuming artifact of wood and hide, battered, smoothed by time. A throne for a courier and a cradle for empire. In the end, it may be the most human part of this whole story. Not the conquests, not the palaces or proclamations, but the quiet decision, made again and again, to keep going, even when the road disappeared, even when the message weighed too much. By the time Kublai Khan assumed power in the mid-13th century, the Mongol postal system had already expanded far beyond its original shape. It had grown like wild grass, sprouting lines in every direction north to the frozen lakes, west to the Caspian, south into jungles that steamed with heat. Useful? Absolutely. Sustainable? Not quite. Kublai inherited not only the empire, but its logistical tangle. Routes overlapped. Stations groaned under demand. Riders were stretched thin. And those once sacred Pesa tablets? They had become so common that even merchants of middling influence could brandish them like royal scepters, demanding luxuries no station could provide. So Kublai, methodical and sharp-eyed, began to revise. First, he reorganized the hierarchy. A new class of regional inspectors, quiet, observant, and often former riders themselves, was sent out across the empire. Their job wasn't flashy. Check the posts, count the horses, measure the food supplies, interview the station masters. It was the kind of work that earned few songs, but rebuilt the system from the ground up. He also standardized the use of Pesa. New ones were issued with serial numbers. Old ones were recalled and melted down. Only those with documented authority, nobles, envoys, senior merchants under imperial contract, could hold one. A message bearing a counterfeit Pesa? Now punishable by imperial decree. And the stations? They too were graded. Some became major hubs, larger, more secure, better stocked. Others were relegated to minor stops. The logic was simple. Efficiency over ambition. No more building outposts just because a noble's nephew wanted to hunt in a remote valley. Everything had to serve the empire's flow of information. Kublai understood something crucial. Empires fall when communication fails. So he restored the pulse. He also invested in new roads, some paved, others reinforced with wood. Bridges were built where ferries once struggled. Along major routes, the Gerdog stations were painted in white or decorated with banners, so travelers could spot them from afar. And yet this was not a top-down revolution. Kublai, despite his imperial grandeur, respected the men on the ground. The station masters, the riders, the scribes. He increased their pay, sent winter supplies early, encouraged their sons to follow their path, offering small exemptions from other duties if they served the Am. There's a story quiet and probably true of Kublai visiting a station in disguise. Whether or not the tale is embroidered, it paints a compelling picture. The great Khan, weary from war, entering a yurt and asking simply for tea, sitting cross-legged by the hearth, listening to the complaints of a man who'd never seen a city, but who held the empire together with rawhide and patience. That's the kind of ruler Kublai aspired to be. And for a time, he was. Under his reforms, the yam system became more than fast. It became durable. And yet even Kublai could not outpace history. As the empire aged, splintered, and frayed at the edges, so too did the roads. The inspections stopped. The bridges fell into disrepair. The Pesa once again became a symbol more than a function. But that moment brief, gleaming when everything ran smoothly under Kublai's watch, that was something to remember. Something that proved, if only for a while, that even the largest empire on earth could be held together, not by fear, but by coordination, by timing, by the sound of hooves at the right hour, bringing the right scroll to the right hands. And somewhere, under a slanted roof of felt and smoke, an old man poured tea for the Khan, and the empire held its breath and moved. Not all journeys in the Mongol postal system were defined by motion. Some were defined by waiting. In the long stretches of the Yang, where the stations sat like lonely teeth along an endless jawbone of road, silence was as much a companion as the horse or the scroll. A courier, weary from 3 days of wind and dust, might dismount at dusk and find a station already full horses tied in rows like quiet shadows, steam rising from their flanks, riders asleep in corners. And so he waited. This was not failure. It was built into the rhythm of things. The system demanded speed, yes, but also endurance. And endurance needs pause. Time to mend a boot, time to boil millet and dry a coat, time to sit by the fire and look for a moment at nothing at all. What do you do in that quiet? You might polish your stirrups, run your fingers along the horse's flank, checking for bruises. Whisper to it not words exactly, but tones, sounds that mean rest or soon or good. Horses remember tones, after all, more than commands. You might sleep for a few hours with your hand still curled around your satchel strap, the document pressed close to your side like a second heartbeat. Some couriers swore they could hear the words in the scroll whispering to them. Instructions, secrets, bargains between men who would never meet, passed hand to hand through days of landscape and fatigue. There were rules. Even in this stillness, you could not open the letter. That was treason. You could not barter the horse. That was theft. You could not linger too long. That was weakness. But for a few hours, in the middle of nowhere, with the sky a dark dome of Bowie, stars and the fire crackling low, you could be still. You could allow yourself to feel the ache in your knees, the cold on your fingers, the comfort of the saddle beneath your folded cloak. Used now as a pillow, even the empire paused sometimes. Not every message could outrun the weather. Sandstorms rolled across the Gobi like angry oceans. Floods carved new paths into familiar trails. And in these moments, the yam curled in on itself, like a great animal taking shelter. There are records scant, but telling of messages arriving late, not because of negligence, but because of Earth's resistance. Snow blocked the pass. Bandits watched the bridge. The water rose above the chest of the horse. These weren't excuses. They were conditions. And the system, despite its vastness, allowed for these. Still, the pressure never vanished. Riders knew. Each hour mattered. Even in pause, you prepared. You plotted the next segment in your mind, reviewed the names of the next station keepers, adjusted the strap that chafed, drank enough water to endure the next leg, but not so much that you'd need to stop again. The silence, then, was a kind of armor, a buffer between the roaring energy of empire and the fragile rhythm of a man trying to survive it. There's poetry in that, if you squint at it sideways. A courier, staring into the coals, the words he carries unread but heavy. The road behind him fading. The road ahead stretching like a song not yet sung. And all around silence, except for the breath of the horse and the weight of history, waiting. If the Mongol postal system was a body, the roads were its bones, the riders its blood, and the messages, they were the thoughts. At the center of this empire of speed and exhaustion lay the scroll, often thin, rolled tightly, sealed with wax or stamped clay. Sometimes simple, just a name and an order. Sometimes Baroque treaties, decrees, invitations to marriage, plans for siege, warnings of rebellion. Paper was precious. In many parts of the empire, it was still rare. In others, particularly the former Chinese territories, paper flowed more freely, and calligraphy had become both art and bureaucracy. The Mongols, practical to the bone, adopted both attitudes at once. They used what was available, prized what was efficient, and occasionally marveled at what was beautiful. A scroll could be no longer than your forearm, or as wide as your chest. Some were folded into layers. Others were bound in leather sleeves. Each had a seal, imperial, noble, military, or mercantile. That seal was everything. It told the station master how urgent the message was. It told the rider how carefully to guard it. It told enemies, if captured, who they were dealing with. Imagine yourself unrolling one gently, slowly, with fingertips. Calloused from rains and frost. The ink is slightly smudged. The paper smells faintly of oil. The letters curve in a script you may not fully understand. But you recognize the shape of the seal, pressed in wax. A tamga, the official mark of authority. Sometimes a falcon. Sometimes a horse. Sometimes just a series of lines, abstract to you, but clear to the receiver. The words inside might declare a new governor, or order the execution of one. They might announce a marriage alliance between two distant khans, or demand new wool quotas from a village whose shepherds haven't yet recovered from last year's raid. The messages were not for you, and yet you carry them every day, in your chest, in your bones. Some riders swore they could feel the difference. A light scroll for taxes, a heavy one for war. Some poets at heart, even if they never wrote, said the scrolls hummed, as if the ink still moved on the page, as if the message wasn't finished, until it reached the next hand, and the seal, that tiny disk of pressed wax or clay, that was the final word, the punctuation at the end of Power's sentence. If it broke, the message was suspect. If it was missing, the message might be a trap. So the seal rode in a pocket close to the heart, protected by leather, guarded with steel. There were stories half true, half hoped of riders who, when cornered by enemies, swallowed the scroll to protect its contents. Others who tore the message into thin strands and scattered it in rivers. Some who memorized the entire contents aloud and carried it in their mind in case the physical message was lost. But mostly, the scroll stayed tucked and safe, past hand to hand like a lit candle, each rider lighting the next, but never looking too closely at the flame. And so the thoughts of the empire moved, carried by men with tired eyes and patient horses, sealed with trust, and opened always in silence. The story of the Mongol postal system is not just one of galloping messengers and sweeping landscapes. It is, at its core, a story about people. And among them, many barely remembered, were the boys who started young. Too young by modern eyes. But out on the steppe, the rhythm of life did not wait for maturity. It came early, like the cold. Imagine one such boy. He is perhaps 13, maybe younger. His name is not recorded. But he wears a wool tunic that reaches past his knees, stiff with old salt from sweat and storm. His fingers are cracked, not from one hard day, but from many. The wind does that carves little notches into the flesh like a sculptor with cold. Invisible tools. He's not yet a full courier, not allowed to carry scrolls of war or policy. But he's in training, which means fetching fresh horses at the next station, running errands between yurts, feeding oats to the older mares, and listening, always listening. The station keeper, a man with a broad nose and heavier silence, teaches not through lectures, but glances. A horse that flicks its ears a certain way needs rest. One that sways too much when tethered has likely been overworked. A puff of breath at the wrong angle might mean colic is coming. These are lessons not in books, but in rhythms. The boy is learning, and one day he is given a scroll, a small one, marked with a modest seal. He will not ride far, only to the next post, perhaps 30 kilometers. But to him, it might as well be to the moon. His horse is older, gentler, the kind given to beginners. Its back is warm, its breath steaming in the morning air like a silent blessing. And the wind is already rising. That wind, the bitter one, comes from the northwest. It carries with it the scent of pine, of frozen water, of something older than the yam itself. It whistles through the grasslands, shaking the tall stems and bending the world sideways. The boy rides into it. He leans forward, mimicking what he's seen in the older riders. Hands low, back loose, eyes scanning the path for rabbit holes and slick patches. The scroll is tucked under his coat. He can feel it against his ribs. Every bump of the horse's stride presses it there, a constant reminder. He does not think of its contents. That is not his task. He thinks of the next fire, the warmth, the tea, and perhaps, if he does well, the nod of approval from the station keeper at the next outpost. The road is rough. Snow lingers in patches, half melted and refrozen. The hooves slip, recover. Once he must dismount to walk the horse across a shallow stream half covered in brittle ice. His boots soak through. He does not speak. By midday he is near. The next station rises like a pale smudge on the horizon. Smoke curls from its roof. He pushes the horse gently. Not faster, but forward. The kind of motion that says, "We're nearly there," without demanding it. And then he is inside. A yurt dimly lit, the scent of mutton and damp felt. He hands over the scroll. It is received without comment, stamped. Logged, the seal remains intact. The boy exhales. Later, he will be allowed to eat with the other riders. They will not praise him, but they will let him sit a little closer to the fire. And that, in the world of couriers, is enough. He sleeps that night with a new kind of tiredness. The tiredness of someone who now knows what the wind tastes like, when it cuts through courage, and still he will ride again. Because that's how the yam worked, not through heroes, but through boys who kept going, even when the wind bit hard. Empires are strange things. They expand, conquer, proclaim their greatness, and then slowly they recede. Not always in flames, sometimes in silence. And when the Mongol Empire began to recede, it left behind traces, ghosts in a way, not of the people but of the system. Scattered across Eurasia, there were stations left standing long after the messengers stopped coming. Posts where horses once whinnied now echoed with nothing but the wind. Storage sheds whose roofs sagged with rot. Their once orderly racks of supplies now occupied by spiders and dust. These were the ghost posts, and they are oddly touching, because for decades, sometimes longer, people kept waiting. In some regions, particularly the outer edges of the empire station keepers, continued their duties even after the imperial authority vanished. They fed the horses, lit the fires, repaired the fences, because what else were they to do? To abandon the post felt wrong, disloyal, even if the empire no longer paid them. Some did it out of habit, others out of quiet defiance. A belief that maybe, just maybe, the system would start up again, that the hoofbeats would return, that the scrolls would reappear in strong gloved hands, and the rhythm would resume. But time had other plans. The routes shifted. Kingdoms fell. The once great highways turned to footpaths, then to overgrown lines, traced only by local shepherds and forgotten by all else. Yet the posts remained. Archaeologists centuries later would stumble upon them. Foundations of square buildings where there should have been none. Ash deposits in a remote valley that matched no local hearth design. Iron fittings that had no purpose in farming or war. They puzzled it out, slowly, and then they realized this was a node in the yam, a single vertebra in the empire's spine. It is strangely moving to think of someone, generations after the last official courier passed through, still tending a garden beside an abandoned post, still telling their children, "This is where the riders came," still sweeping the floor. In that way, the Mongol system left behind more than logistics. It left behind habits, behaviors, a rhythm. Some roads never fully vanished. Caravans continued to use the routes for trade. Nomads lingered near the old stations for shelter. In a few places, the posts became towns, waypoints for new empires, who built their own systems atop the Mongol bones. But in many places, the roads faded, and the posts stood, ghosts, not haunting, just waiting. Waiting for a rider who would never return. Waiting for a message that had already been delivered centuries ago. Waiting, like so much of history, to be remembered. And now you remember, the wind shifts. And somewhere far away, a horse whinnies in a dream. Empires are strange things. They expand, conquer, proclaim their greatness, and then slowly they recede. Not always in flames, sometimes in silence. And when the Mongol Empire began to recede, it left behind traces, ghosts in a way, not of the people but of the system. Scattered across Eurasia, there were stations left standing long after the messengers stopped coming. Posts where horses once whinnied now echoed with nothing but the wind. Storage sheds whose roofs sagged with rot. Their once orderly racks of supplies now occupied by spiders and dust. These were the ghost posts, and they are oddly touching, because for decades, sometimes longer, people kept waiting. In some regions, particularly the outer edges of the Empire station keepers, continued their duties even after the imperial authority vanished. They fed the horses, lit the fires, repaired the fences, because what else were they to do? To abandon the post felt wrong, disloyal, even if the empire no longer paid them. Some did it out of habit, others out of quiet defiance. A belief that maybe, just maybe, the system would start up again, that the hoofbeats would return, that the scrolls would reappear in strong gloved hands, and the rhythm would resume. But time had other plans. The routes shifted. Kingdoms fell. The once great highways turned to footpaths, then to overgrown lines, traced only by local shepherds and forgotten by all else. Yet the posts remained. Archaeologists centuries later would stumble upon them. Foundations of square buildings where there should have been none. Ash deposits in a remote valley that matched no local hearth design. Iron fittings that had no purpose in farming or war. They puzzled it out, slowly, and then they realized this was a node in the yam, a single vertebra in the empire's spine. It is strangely moving to think of someone, generations after the last official courier passed through, still tending a garden beside an abandoned post, still telling their children, "This is where the riders came," still sweeping the floor. In that way, the Mongol system left behind more than logistics. It left behind habits, behaviors, a rhythm. Some roads never fully vanished. Caravans continued to use the routes for trade. Nomads lingered near the old stations for shelter. In a few places, the posts became towns, waypoints for new empires, who built their own systems atop the Mongol bones. But in many places, the roads faded, and the posts stood, ghosts, not haunting, just waiting. Waiting for a rider who would never return. Waiting for a message that had already been delivered centuries ago. Waiting, like so much of history, to be remembered. And now you remember, the wind shifts. And somewhere far away, a horse whinnies in a dream. In the quiet moments before dawn, the Mongol steppe seemed still. The vast expanse of grass ripples gently in the wind, and the first pale light brushes the horizon with soft gold. But beneath this calm lies the heartbeat of the empire, the endless march of horses. Horses were the lifeblood of the Mongol postal system. Without them, the yam would be nothing more than an idea, a promise unfulfilled. The riders depended on these animals to carry messages swiftly across deserts, mountains, and frozen plains. The horses were tireless, hardy, and bred for endurance rather than speed alone. Imagine the smell of the stable at a way station, thick, with hay and earth, mingled with the sharp scent of sweat and animal musk. The low sounds of hooves shifting, soft snorts, and the rustle of leather tack create a steady lullaby. Each horse is tended carefully, brushed to clear the dust, their manes braided or trimmed to prevent tangling, their hooves inspected for cracks or injuries. Yet life was not easy for these horses. The demands placed upon them were immense. A single horse might carry a rider for 30 to 40 kilometers before being swapped for a fresh mount, but the distances and terrain were relentless. Mountain passes tested their shoe-footedness. Deserts drained their strength. Icy winds bit at their flanks. Station keepers took their duty seriously, knowing the empire depended on the health of these animals. They stored grain and fodder, mixed, herbs into water to soothe colic, and carried out simple remedies for injuries. Sometimes, a lame or tired horse would be retired to pasture, replaced by a younger, stronger one. The riders formed deep bonds with their mounts. They spoke softly to them during long rides, soothing their nerves. They memorized the quirks of each horse, the way one shied from shadows, the stubbornness of another when trotting uphill. Horses and riders became partners in a delicate dance against time and exhaustion. Imagine the steady rhythm of hooves on dirt and stone as the sun climbs. Higher dust rising in lazy spirals. The horses march on, uncomplaining, their breath misting in the cool morning air. They carry the pulse of an empire, letters that might contain orders of war, pleas for aid, or simple news from distant homes. In this eternal march, each step is a small miracle of endurance, trust, and survival. Pause for a moment, listen to the imagined sound of hooves fading into the distance, carrying with them the endless stories of a world that once was. As the sun dipped below the rolling Mongol steppe, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber, the way stations of the yam began to hum softly with life. These stations, often little more than clusters of yurts or simple wooden huts, were sanctuaries amid vast, often unforgiving landscapes. Here, riders and horses found a moment's reprieve from the ceaseless journey. Imagine yourself stepping into one such station as dusk falls. The scent of burning wood mingles with the faint aroma of boiled maize milk and roasting millet. A small fire crackles cheerfully in a stone hearth, its glow casting flickering shadows that dance gently across rough-hewn walls. Around this fire, riders gather quietly, their faces weary but calm, voices low and measured. Fires at these stations were more than mere warmth. They were anchors in the night, a shared pulse of life against the dark expanse outside. Around them, couriers would exchange brief, half-whispered tales of their travels. A distant storm that delayed a rider by days, a narrow escape from bandits lurking near a river crossing, or simply the stubbornness of a particularly fractious horse. But even here, in moments of rest, the demands of the yam whispered persistently. Riders knew that by morning they would mount again, continuing the relentless relay. For now, the fire offered a moment's sanctuary, a brief pause in the eternal race against time. Imagine the textures of this scene, the rough wool of your cloak against your skin, the warmth seeping from the fire into chilled fingers, the soft murmur of conversation, woven with laughter so quiet it barely breaks the silence. Nearby, the horses rest tethered in small stalls or low-fenced yards, their breath steady puffs in the cooling air. In these stations, hospitality was pragmatic but heartfelt. A simple meal of boiled grains, salted meat, or dried fruits replenished weary. bodies. Tea brewed from wild herbs or dried leaves soothed throats parched from dust and wind. Sometimes, a child of the station keeper might bring fresh water or tend the fire, eyes curious but respectful. The fires also kindled a softer human connection. Amid the empire's vast machinery, riders, often strangers to one another, found brief companionship here. A shared understanding passed in glances and small gestures. The nod that says, "I know this road," the silent offer of a leather pouch. With a little food, the careful listening to a tale of hardship that resonates deeply. And yet, even in warmth, exhaustion seeped into the bones. The yam's endless demand pressed upon them all riders, horses, and keepers alike. The firelight flickered against faces drawn tight with the strain of sleepless nights and endless miles. As you listen, imagine the contrast between the crackling fire and the silent step beyond, the tension between movement and stillness, between isolation and fleeting connection. A fire is a quiet lullaby. Its warmth invites rest, even as the world outside waits, patient and unyielding. The vastness of the Mongol Empire was both awe-inspiring and daunting. Stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe, it was a realm of deserts, mountains, rivers, and endless plains. To manage this sprawling domain, the empire required not only fast horses and tireless riders, but also a sophisticated system of maps and wayfinding. Imagine a cartographer's workroom, somewhere deep in the empire of space, filled with scrolls, inkpots, brushes, and rough sketches of winding roads and distant landmarks. These maps were not just geographical tools. They were the empire's nervous system, guiding couriers through deserts, blistered by sun, and mountains veiled in mist. But mapping in the 13th century was an art wrapped in uncertainty. The Mongols relied on a mixture of oral knowledge, first-hand accounts, and carefully gathered data. Riders' reports, descriptions of rivers, mountain passes, or tribal territories were transcribed into rough sketches. Over time, these sketches evolved into more detailed maps, treasured and guarded in administrative centers. The maps balanced precision with poetry. A mountain might be drawn as a jagged line crowned with a small symbol for snow. A river could be a winding stroke of blue ink, sometimes annotated with warnings about currents or fords. Roads were marked, not just by distance, but by the quality of the terrain. Rough stones ahead, marshy ground after the oak grove, shelter near the great cedar. Imagine running your fingers over one of these maps. The texture of the parchment rough beneath your touch. The ink faded in places, smudged by years of handling and the occasional spill of tea or ink. Each line is a memory, each mark a guide, for a rider who might rely on it to avoid danger or find rest. The art of mapping was closely tied to the postal system's efficiency. The better the maps, the fewer detours, the fewer exhausted horses lost to unfamiliar terrain. Station keepers memorized routes and terrain features, offering guidance to riders facing the unknown. This knowledge was power. It allowed the empire's messages to cross great distances, weaving a web of communication that linked the farthest reaches of Mongol rule. As you listen, imagine the quiet concentration of the mapmaker, the careful strokes of brush on parchment, the soft crackle of dried ink, the weight of responsibility to capture a landscape so vast it seems endless. And imagine the rider who, hours later, will unfold such a map beneath a star-filled sky, planning the next leg of a journey that stretches into dawn. The scrolls carried by Mongol couriers were not mere pieces of parchment. They were vessels of fate. Imagine unrolling one of these thin sheets, the edges curling gently from age and travel. The ink, though faded, still holds the power to command armies, shift alliances, and alter the course of empires. Some messages were simple: a request for supplies, a routine report on weather or harvest. but others bore the heavy weight of history decrees from the Great Khan, threats to distant rulers, or delicate negotiations crafted in the smoky tents of the imperial court. The couriers who bore these messages rarely knew their contents. Their task was not to read, but to carry. And yet, imagine the quiet pressure of holding a letter that might, unseen, carry a death sentence or a promise of peace. Consider the famous letter sent by Genghis Khan to the Khwarezm Shah, demand for safe passage and trade rights, delivered swiftly across deserts and mountains by the Yam's riders. The Shah's refusal sparked a chain of events that led to one of the most dramatic conquests in history. Or picture the letters that moved between Mongol generals and their commanders in distant provinces, coordinating sieges or reinforcing supply lines. Each word, each phrase, was carefully chosen to convey urgency, authority, and precision. The very existence of the postal system made the empire possible. Without the ability to communicate quickly across vast distances, the Mongols could never have coordinated their rapid campaigns or maintained control over diverse peoples. But the weight of words was also a burden. The couriers, exhausted and relentless, were the bearers of messages that sometimes meant suffering or upheaval. They carried the empire's demands, but also its fears and hopes. And so imagine the moment a rider passes a scroll to the next station keeper, the seal still intact, the words unread but heavy with consequence. A chain of trust stretched across time and terrain. In this quiet exchange lies the pulse of an empire fragile, immense, and human. The Mongol postal system thrived on one eternal truth. No single rider could cover the empire alone. It was a relay, a chain of bodies and beasts, passing the baton of communication from hand to hand, horse to horse. Picture a line of way stations, spaced across thousands of miles. At each one, horses stood tethered, their flanks heaving gently in the cool air, nostrils flaring with the scent of distant grass and smoke. Riders arrived weary but resolute, clutching scrolls wrapped tightly against their chests. They dismounted, with a practiced ease, handing over their letters and their worn steeds. Fresh horses were saddled, and riders prepared to launch once more into the vastness. The system was a marvel of coordination. Station keepers kept detailed logs, tracking each message's progress with meticulous care. Riders memorized routes, weather patterns, and terrain challenges. Horses were rested, fed, and treated with an almost reverential attention. Yet beneath this efficiency lay a deeper rhythm, a rhythm of human endurance and hope. Imagine the riders. Steady breath, the soft creak of leather, the rhythmic pounding of hooves on earth and stone. Each step forward was a testament to resilience, a silent vow to carry the empire's voice across the wilderness. At times, the relay was interrupted by storms, bandits, or the simple weariness of horses and men. But the system adapted, finding new routes, new riders, new strength. Behind every message was a chain of human effort men who rose before dawn, who faced biting winds and burning sun, who bore the loneliness of endless miles. And so, the postal system was more than logistics. It was a story of endurance, connection, and the fragile heartbeat of empire. As you listen now, imagine the endless line of riders, their silhouettes merging with the horizon, the echo of horses' hooves fading into distance, carrying with them the hopes and fears of a world forever. On the move. Imagine for a moment the humble station keeper, an often overlooked but vital figure in the sprawling network of the Mongol postal system. While the riders sped across the steppe, it was the station keepers who formed the backbone of the operation, the quiet guardians ensuring the system ran smoothly. The station keeper's day began long before dawn, often with the first hints of frost clinging to the grass. His responsibilities were many: feeding and watering horses, repairing fences and equipment, tending the fires that warmed the station's hearths, and preparing provisions for the next wave of couriers. Picture a small, sturdy earth or wooden hut nestled against the wind. Smoke curls gently from the chimney, carrying the scent of burning juniper and dried herbs. Inside, the station keeper moves with practiced care fetching bundles of hay, checking the water supply and oiling leather. Saddles. The quiet intensity of his work belies its importance. A neglected horse could mean a delayed message or even a lost life. A broken harness might slow a rider at a critical moment. The station keeper's vigilance was the difference between success and failure. Yet the work was not without its challenges. The keepers often lived isolated lives, separated from families and villages by vast distances. Winters were harsh, with biting winds that seemed to seep through even the thickest layers of felt and wool. Summer brought swarms of insects, and the relentless sun beating down on parched earth. Despite these hardships, station keepers upheld an unspoken code of commitment to the empire and to the men who depended on them. They were the stewards of a system that demanded reliability, endurance, and trust. Imagine the station keeper's pride when a fresh rider galloped into view, weary but unharmed, bearing a sealed scroll. The tired horses were exchanged swiftly, and the courier was offered a warm meal and a chance to rest. At night, as the station settled into quiet, the keeper might sit by the fire, mending reins or quietly listening to the wind outside. The vast steppe seemed to hold its breath, waiting for dawn and the next arrival. In these solitary moments, the station keeper's role was clear, not just as a caretaker of animals and supplies, but as a guardian of communication, connection, and the lifeblood of an empire stretching across continents. Imagine the patience it took, the steady heartbeat of duty that kept the wheels turning and the messages flowing. The Mongol postal system was not only a messenger of words and commands, but also a carrier of goods, gifts, and treasures. Picture the caravan trails bustling with more than just riders clutching scrolls, sacks of silk, chests of spices, bundles of furs, and delicately wrapped gifts moving across vast landscapes. Imagine the contrast of the dusty steppe with the softness of silk gliding in the breeze. These goods were symbols of trade, diplomacy, and culture, weaving through the empires. Arteries alongside urgent letters and military orders. Silk was particularly prized, a fabric that shimmered in the sunlight, light as a whisper yet strong enough to endure the roughness of travel. Merchants and couriers alike handled it with care, aware that these delicate threads connected distant lands and peoples in a web of commerce and influence. Spices, too, held their own importance. The aroma of cinnamon, cloves, and saffron mingled with the dry scent of earth and horse sweat, a fragrant reminder of the world's vastness and variety. Traders relied on the yam's speed and security to transport these goods safely, often paying high prices for the privilege. Yet, alongside the luxury, there were everyday necessities, bolts of fabric, foodstuffs, tools that sustained lives far from the bustling cities. Imagine a rider adjusting his load, a small bundle of silk carefully folded beside his saddle, a tightly wrapped package of dried meat secured beneath his cloak, the weight balanced with precision, the contents protected from dust and rain. The movement of these goods was a silent force binding the empire together. Gifts exchanged between rulers symbolized alliances and respect. Trade goods fueled economies and introduced new tastes, textures, and ideas. The yam's roots became veins of cultural exchange, carrying not only messages, but the very essence of connection across vast distances. As you listen, imagine the soft rustle of silk against leather, the faint scent of exotic spices carried on the wind, and the steady clip-clop of horses' hooves over ancient trails. In these quiet details lies the heartbeat of an empire, vast, interconnected, and endlessly moving. Imagine, if you will, a lone rider setting out at dawn, The vast Mongol steppe stretching endlessly ahead, a canvas of earth and sky painted in muted greens and golds. The path is far from easy. It twists and turns through mountains, skirts deserts, and crosses rivers that swell unpredictably with seasonal rains. The terrain itself seems alive, sometimes gentle, sometimes fiercely unyielding. The Mongol postal system, though famed for its speed and efficiency, was always at the mercy of these natural challenges. The riders and the horses that bore them were forced to contend daily with the elements and the geography of a massive continent. Consider the desert's arid seas of sand and rock that shimmer under a scorching sun. The heat during the day is oppressive, the sun relentless, and the nights can plunge into chilling cold. Water sources are few and far between, so every drop is precious. Riders ration their sips carefully, knowing that dehydration can come suddenly, sapping strength and dulling alertness. The desert wind carries fine dust that clogs nostrils and stings eyes. Imagine the effort of pressing forward despite the grit, the swirl of sand battering exposed skin, and the muffled sound of hooves thudding against dry, cracked ground. The landscape offers little shelter, forcing riders to endure the elements with stoic resolve. Mountain passes, too, present their own trials. Jagged rocks, steep inclines, and narrow ledges demand careful footing. Horses must be sure-footed, their hooves finding purchase on slippery stones or loose gravel. Riders balance deftly, their eyes scanning for signs of landslides or sudden drops. The air thins as altitude rises, making breath shallow and movements slower. Imagine the chill of wind that whistles through mountain ridges, carrying the scent of pine and frost. Snow may linger well into spring, turning trails into treacherous ice. A single misstep could lead to a fall dangerous not only for rider and horse, but for the message that must arrive intact. Rivers and streams are both friend and foe. Their waters can refresh and restore, but swollen currents in muddy banks can stall progress. Bridges are rare. Many crossings require dismounting, leading horses carefully through icy water, or finding shallow fords. Imagine the cold biting at fingers and legs, the sound of rushing, water masking other dangers. Seasonal weather swings add further complexity. Spring brings sudden storms and muddy trails that bog down horses. Summer heat saps energy, while autumn's early frosts chill bones. Winter snows can close passes entirely, isolating entire regions for days or weeks. Despite these challenges, the yam was remarkably resilient. Routes were chosen with care to balance speed and safety, and riders were trained to adapt to their environment. Station keepers prepared supplies for all seasons, bundles of fodder for winter, water caches for summer. Imagine the steady rhythm of hoofbeats adjusting to terrain, a careful trot on rocky slopes, a rapid gallop across open plains, a cautious walk through marshy fields. Each change in pace reflects a conversation between rider and landscape, a negotiation shaped by centuries of experience. Through all of this, the rider remains alert, listening to the subtle signs of weather, the distant roll of thunder, the sudden silence of birds, each a clue to what lies ahead. The postal system's success depended not just on speed, but on this deep knowledge of terrain and climate, on the patient endurance of men and horses alike. As you listen now, imagine the shifting landscapes passing by, the endless steppe dissolving into hills, the golden light of dawn touching frost-covered grass, the cold snap of wind against your cheek. The road less traveled is never easy, but it is the road that keeps an empire connected. Behind every swift letter and every fresh horse stands a network of human lives woven into the endless pulse of the Mongol postal system. To speak of this network is to recognize the toll exacted on bodies and spirits, a quiet exhaustion, often invisible but profound. Imagine the riders themselves, young men, sometimes barely adults, thrust into roles that demanded more than speed. They faced the harshness of the elements, the loneliness of miles unbroken by village or neighbor, and the ever-present pressure to maintain the chain of communication unbroken. The weight of their mission was both physical and psychological. Long days blurred into nights with little sleep. Food was often meager dried meat, hard bread, occasionally fresh milk fuel that barely sustained them on grueling journeys. Fatigue seeped deep, muscles ached, and blisters gathered beneath warm leather. In moments of rest, riders might lean against weathered wooden posts or slumped within tents, their faces drawn tight with strain. Conversations were brief, often exchanges of encouragement or simple logistics, but beneath them ran a shared current of weariness. Injuries were common: falls from horses, cuts from thorns, or sickness brought on by exhaustion and exposure. The isolation of stations meant medical care was rudimentary at best. Herbs and folk remedies were applied with varying success. More serious wounds could become fatal in the absence of proper treatment. Station keepers, while diligent, could only do so much. They tended animals and men alike, offering what comfort they could: a hot meal, a place by the fire, a moment of rest. But the demands of the system rarely allowed for prolonged recovery. Families of riders often lived in anxious waiting. Letters might be delayed or lost. The fate of a son or brother was uncertain until the courier returned. Dust-covered and bone-tired, the Empire's relentless march left personal stories largely untold. There were also darker realities. Riders were vulnerable to bandits and hostile tribes who saw them as valuable targets. The risk of ambush meant that even the fastest horse could not guarantee safety. Some riders vanished into the wilderness, their letters lost and their stories unfinished. Imagine the quiet courage required to mount a horse each morning, knowing the dangers that lay ahead, to push onward despite cold, hunger, and fear, driven by duty and perhaps a flicker of hope. Yet, amid these hardships, there was a profound resilience. The riders' efforts kept distant provinces linked, allowed commanders to strategize, and rulers to govern. Their endurance was a testament to the human spirit's capacity to sustain connection across vast divides. As you listen now, imagine the steady breath of a rider beneath a wide, star-filled sky, the gentle thud of hooves softened by earth and time, the quiet sacrifice woven into the Empire's heartbeat. The cost was high, but the message carried on. Imagine the quiet echo of hooves fading into the distance across the vast, an ancient rhythm that, though silenced by time, has left an imprint on the world we know today. The Mongol Postal System, or YAM, was not merely a relic of history. It laid foundational principles that echo in modern communication networks. Consider for a moment the world before instant messaging, before the electric hum of phones and satellites. For centuries, the fastest way to communicate was by horseback, the breath of riders and the sweat of horses carrying words across mountains and deserts. The YAM's innovation was not just in speed, but in the system's organization, a network of relays, stations, and standardized protocols that could be adapted and scaled. The Mongol system introduced the idea that communication could be centralized and state-controlled, yet decentralized enough to cover vast territories efficiently. This balance between central command and local execution is a principle found in many postal and courier systems that followed, from the Persian Empire to the Pony Express, and ultimately to modern postal services worldwide. Imagine the way stations of the YAM transformed into mail depots, and riders became mail carriers. On bicycles, cars, and planes, the relay system morphed into hubs and sorting centers, connected by a web of roads, railways, and air routes. The concept of official seals and coded messages used in the Mongol Empire to authenticate documents resonates today in signatures, stamps, and encryption. Trust and security in communication remain as vital now as they were then. But beyond the practical, the legacy is also cultural. The idea that messages could travel rapidly and reliably helped reshape politics, commerce, and society. It allowed distant leaders to govern, merchants to trade over long distances, and cultures to exchange ideas. Imagine how different the modern world might be without this ancient spark, the realization that messages, like goods and people, could be moved swiftly and systematically across continents. Even now, when you drop a letter in a mailbox or send an email, you participate in a long tradition that traces back to those lonely riders braving steppe winds, mountain snows, and desert suns. The silence left by their passing is deep but resonant. It reminds us that the past is never truly gone. It whispers through our daily lives in ways small and profound. As you listen, picture a modern postal worker sorting mail, the soft shuffle of envelopes, the hum of machines. Across time and space, the pulse of connection beats steady and true. The story of the Mongol postal system is also a story of change, how even the greatest innovations face the quiet, relentless force of time. After reaching the zenith of its power, the yam began to evolve, fade, and transform, reflecting the shifting realities of empire, politics, and technology. Imagine the vast empire gradually fracturing, the winds of change sweeping through the steppes. Internal conflicts, succession struggles, and the pressures of ruling distant territories stretched the Mongol administration thin. Maintaining such an extensive and demanding postal system became increasingly difficult. Riders found their routes disrupted by warfare or local unrest. Station keepers struggled with dwindling resources and manpower. Some way stations fell into disrepair, their fires extinguished, their horses gone. Yet the legacy of the yam did not vanish overnight. In some regions, it adapted, blending with local practices and infrastructure. In China, for example, the Mongol established postal routes were integrated into the existing imperial courier systems, influencing later dynasties. Imagine couriers navigating the changing landscape roads once ruled by Mongol riders now traveled by new powers, new protocols emerging. The spirit of rapid communication endured even as the face of the system shifted. At the same time, new technologies began to reshape communication. The spread of paper and printing, improved road networks, and eventually the introduction of telegraphs marked a slow departure from horseback relays. Imagine a rider pausing at a station to hand over a message, unaware that centuries later, his horse would be replaced by wires carrying electrical pulses. The ancient rhythms would slow, then transform into something entirely new. The decline of the yam reminds us that no system, no matter how vast or efficient, is permanent. Empires rise and fall, technologies change, and societies evolve. But the seeds planted by the Mongol postal system continued to grow, influencing how humans connect across distances even now. As you settle into this thought, imagine the quiet turning of pages in a history book, the soft flicker of a candle in a scholar's study. The past is not gone, it is carried forward in memory, in innovation, in every letter and message still sent. Imagine a sprawling tapestry, threads stretching far and wide, each thread representing a life caught in the great machinery of the Mongol postal system. This was no simple network of horses and riders, but a living web of human effort, connection, and endurance, a mosaic of stories, struggles, and quiet perseverance. Picture the countless individuals who formed the invisible backbone of the yam. Beyond the riders and station keepers we have met, there were the blacksmiths who forged horseshoes that would endure rough terrains, the cooks who prepared simple meals to sustain weary travelers, the stable hands who cleaned and tended to the horses, and the merchants who entrusted their precious goods to the care of the couriers. Imagine a young stable hand rising before dawn, hands calloused from years of work, greeting the chill of the steppe morning. His world is the scent of hay and leather, the gentle nickering of horses, and the steady rhythm of hooves on dirt. In his small yurt, warmth is scant, but duty compels him. The health of the horses, the strength of the steeds, is crucial. Without them, the system falters. Around him, the world hums with the urgency of 1,000 messages. Every day, these individuals labor not for glory or fame, but for continuity. Their work, humble yet vital, stitches together an empire that spans continents. Consider also the families scattered across the steppe and settled towns, their lives touched indirectly, yet profoundly by the postal system. A letter from a distant relative, delivered faster than before, might bring news of harvests, weddings, or hardship. The yam's reach was not only political or military, it was deeply personal. Imagine the quiet anticipation of a mother waiting for word of her son, riding somewhere far away, a rider whose face is unfamiliar, but whose role connects her to the heartbeat of an empire. The letters carried by the yam were not just commands or decrees, but also threads of human connection across vast and lonely distances. Yet, for all its grandeur, the system was a source of strain. The relentless pace wore on bodies and spirits. Alike, riders risked their lives. Horses labored to the brink. Station keepers bore the isolation of remote outposts. The empire's ambitions demanded constant motion, an unending cycle of arrivals and departures. Amid these demands, there was also camaraderie, quiet friendships forged by shared hardship, and mutual reliance. Imagine riders huddled around a fire, sharing dried meat and whispered stories, finding warmth not only in the flames but in the fellowship. In this human web, every link mattered. A delay at one station rippled outward, affecting commanders, merchants, and families. The yam was an ecosystem of lives intertwined, a testament to the resilience of ordinary people sustaining extraordinary endeavors. As you listen, imagine the soft murmur of voices in a way station, the steady stamping of horses, the creak of leather saddles, and the worn hands of a stable boy brushing down a tired steed. The empire's vastness was bridged by these quiet moments of care and connection. The Mongol postal system was more than infrastructure. It was a living network, pulsing with human breath and heartbeats. As we explore the vast world of the Mongol postal system, it is impossible to ignore the stark contrasts between the lives of those who sustained it and the elites who used it. The yam was a conduit of power, a means for rulers, nobles, and high officials to project influence swiftly across their domains. But with power came privilege, and the gulf between elite riders and common couriers was vast. Imagine the richly appointed tents of Mongol aristocrats, draped in fine textiles dyed vibrant reds and blues, the scent of incense lingering in the air. Here, the atmosphere contrasts sharply with the wind-swept stations and dusty roads endured by ordinary riders. These elites commanded the system's resources, sending urgent orders and receiving news that shaped empires. Elite couriers were often mounted on the finest horses, animals specially bred and trained for speed and endurance. Their equipment was superior, saddles cushioned with leather, bridles adorned with silver fittings, and coats woven from the softest wool. Their riders were skilled warriors or trusted nobles, entrusted not only with messages, but with delicate diplomacy and strategy. Picture a noble courier departing at dawn, the sun glinting off his polished armor, his steed's hooves striking a rhythmic drumbeat on the earth. His mission is critical, perhaps a treaty, a summons to battle, or a decree that will change the fate of provinces. Meanwhile, common riders often wore simple tunics patched from years of use. Their horses were sturdy, but less refined, and their routes were longer and more grueling. The pressure on them was immense, for failure could mean punishment, yet their rewards were scant. Elite privilege extended beyond mere equipment. The Yam's way stations reserved special accommodations for high-ranking couriers, fresh horses ready on arrival, meals of rich meat and bread, and rest in heated tents shielded from the cold. Their journeys, while demanding, were cushioned by the empire's wealth. The social divide within the Yam reflected broader hierarchies in Mongol society, where status dictated access to comfort and influence. Yet the system depended equally on both ends, the privileged few who issued commands and the many who carried them. Imagine, too, the complex dynamics this created among riders and station keepers. Respect mixed with resentment, loyalty with weariness. The empire's machinery moved on the strength of these contradictions. As you listen, picture the glittering tent beside the modest yurt, the ornate saddle beside the rough-hewn wooden bench, the proud noble and the exhausted courier sharing the same night sky, though worlds apart. The Mongol postal system was a grand enterprise, a testament to coordination and control, but also a mirror reflecting the divides of power, privilege, and endurance. Imagine the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire slowly unraveling, its once vibrant arteries of communication growing faint and fractured. The Yam, which had been the empire's lifeblood, began to falter as political turmoil and fragmentation took hold. Yet even as the great Khan's power waned, the whisper of the postal system lingered like a distant echo across the steppe. Visualize the way stations, once bustling with activity, horses restless, riders arriving and departing in steady rhythm now, quiet and deserted. Some stations were reclaimed by the earth, their wooden posts rotted and their fires long extinguished. Others were absorbed into the emerging polities that rose from the empire's remnants, repurposed or forgotten. The relentless march of history brought new rulers with different priorities. The once centralized command of the Yam splintered into regional systems, smaller and less efficient. In some places, local chieftains maintained parts of the network, adapting it for their own needs, while elsewhere, the system collapsed entirely. Picture a courier setting out from a small town, the legacy of the Yam still present in the well-worn paths beneath his horse's hooves. His journey is slower, more uncertain. The grand coordination of an empire replaced by fragmented routes and isolated posts. Messages arrive late, if at all, and the swift currents of communication slow to a trickle. Yet, even in decline, the Yam's influence endured. The system had planted seeds of connectivity, inspiring later empires and cultures to develop their own postal networks. The idea that messages could cross vast distances with speed and reliability remained a beacon of governance and control. Imagine the transmission of knowledge, culture, and governance that flowed along these routes for decades after the Mongol Empire's collapse. The roads once trodden by imperial riders became conduits of trade, pilgrimage, and migration. The Yam's imprint was indelible. As you listen, picture the fading sunset casting long shadows over empty way stations, the faint call of a distant horseman carried on the wind, and the soft rustle of grass reclaiming old paths. The empire's whisper fades, but it never quite disappears. In these quiet remnants lies a lesson that even great systems are fragile, subject to the tides of change, yet their echoes persist, shaping worlds long after their glory has passed. Now, imagine yourself as one of the countless riders who have traversed these vast lands, the endless sky stretching overhead, the steady beat of hooves marking the passage of time. The journey is coming to an end, the long ride home after a day, a month, or even years of service. There is a profound stillness in this moment, a quiet that settles over muscles tired from exertion, over minds shaped by miles and messages. The horizon softens in the fading light, and the world feels wide and deep. Reflect on the extraordinary feat of human endurance and coordination that was the Mongol postal system. It was more than a network of roads and horses. It was a living organism sustained by countless hands and hearts, by courage and resilience, by patience and persistence. Imagine the riders return to home and hearth, the worn saddle exchanged for soft ground, the sharp wind replaced by the warmth of a fire. Their stories carried silently in their eyes tales of endless horizons, fleeting encounters, and the ceaseless flow of messages that bound an empire together. Consider how the rhythms of the yam mirror the rhythms of our own lives, the daily. Cycles of work and rest, of connection and solitude. The system's legacy invites us to ponder the ties that bind us across distance and time. As you settle into this thought, picture the soft glow of twilight, the whisper of the wind through the grass, the gentle breathing of horses resting after their long run. There is peace here in endurance, in connection, in the quiet passing of time. The Mongol postal system was, in the end, a story of movement and stillness intertwined, of voices carried across empty spaces, and of a world forever in motion, yet anchored by human will. Let this reflection guide you now toward rest, carrying the echoes of 1,000 journeys into your dreams.